So Adrian, thank you so much for inviting your joint venture partners. I mean, it's very rare that we get to hear from the money partner. And so for those of you that were listening in, that was like solid gold information, because it really helps you understand A, what money partners are thinking, and B, that if you produce a good deal and show that you're trustworthy and produce great value, people are going to want to do business with you. 50% is very, very fair if you bring the right amount of value to the table and articulate in the right way. Now, that's my segue, because speaking of a 50-50 deal, Adrian and I just did a 50-50 deal with 4 people who put in $1 million on a $3.5 million apartment building. So there's a lot of different ways that we can take this. Adrian, we're going to be probably a little bit strapped for time.
Sure.
And because I'm on my phone now, I can't see the chat window anymore, so I don't even know what's going on. So, you're doing such an awesome job of leading the conversation. Why don't we riff off of this? You ask me some questions, I'll ask you some questions. Let's try to be punchy with our answers. And if a great question comes up in the chat feed, if anybody has a question, put it in the chat feed, and we'll try to answer it, and we'll try to be succinct. But let's go through this deal, because it's a whole other playing field when you're raising huge chunks of capital from multiple partners and then getting them all to coordinate.
100%. We did have one question pop up, and it's a super quick question.
Okay.
So Angie asked, just curious, with the money partner, do they put in money or mortgage or both for 50% share? So great question, Angie. Yes. So what happens with a joint venture like 50-50 is they are the money capital partner, which means mortgage, down payment. And we've been able to structure our renovation costs, so it's not a huge chunk of money. So they're responsible for that. We're responsible for essentially everything else, managing all that sort of stuff. And then they get paid back their initial investment, and all profits get split 50-50 after that. So that is the way that the structure happens. But to I guess start this conversation, it's definitely a huge thing for investors. And I know, James, you and I working with different investors focusing on residential to commercial. Most people want to step up that game, and it's going from 1 to 2 doors, 2 to 4, and then 4 to 8, and 8 to 16, and we just keep going and going. So for me, the big thing getting into this was just stepping up my game as well. And with James looking at his perspective and the way that he was able to come together and raise capital to buy 13 apartment buildings, I was just like, wow, this guy is super talented. How do I get a piece of this? How do I get involved with making this happen?
Yeah, I mean, to pass that compliment back to Adrian, I mean, yeah, I'm no spring chicken at this. I've done 13 joint venture deals on 13 apartment buildings, but in working with Adrian as a realtor on my team, I just recognized how talented he was. And truth be told, just to echo what Brent and Wendy said, I got to the point in my joint venturing career where I have expertise. I had a network of investors that I knew wanted to work with me, and I knew how to put a deal together. And Adrian can attest to this, there are hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of tasks that are associated with the execution of a joint venture. And those were hours that I didn't want to do. So I said, hey, Adrian, why don't you and I partner up as co-working partners? I will provide all of the expertise. I'll dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure this deal happens successfully. We can use my track record and reputation to attract partners, which should work really well. But when it comes to all the site visits, chasing around paperwork, having 1,000,001 conversations with the mortgage broker, doing all of the spreadsheet auditing, and you're putting in that time. You're the energy, you're the young go-getter, and I'll provide the expertise, and we'll bring in money partners together. So that was the genesis of our partnership. When we do that same activity of like, line down the center of the page, who's doing what. That's how we got this thing going.
100%. Yeah. And that's, from the get-go, we knew exactly what our responsibilities were. So there wasn't any like, hey, are you going to do this or am I going to do this? That was super clear from the get-go. And I think that kind of talks about what Brent and Wendy said too, that those roles and responsibilities were pretty clear right from the beginning. So everyone knew what their job was and what the expectations were. And when James and we have conversations with agents on our team, expectation setting is probably the most important thing you can do in any business relationship, because if the expectations are not aligned, nobody's actually going to be happy, because their expectations are here, maybe yours is here, and there's this middle ground that needs to come together. So I think, James, that was part of the big thing, and the knowledge that James brought to it was, how do we set expectations not only with the co-working partners together, but also with the joint venture partners?
Yeah, and that formed part of the pitch. I mean, the nice thing is we did. So there's kind of three philosophies in joint venturing, and I'll try to touch on them quickly. There's the deal first philosophy, which is if you got a hot deal, lock it up, even if you don't have a partner, and a partner will show up. Then there's the partner first mentality, which is create a sample deal, pitch the heck out of it to as many people as you can, get people interested in a concept, and then find a deal that matches the concept. And then there's the hybridized version, which is what we have the ability to do, especially with my network, having done 13 of these deals. I've got a database of thousands of people, and anybody who's ever said to me, hey, James, if you see an interesting deal that you might be worth putting some money into, or I might be interested in doing one of your apartment building deals, I just put a little note beside them saying that that's what they're into. And then anytime I see a good deal, I can just do a search for people that have put up their hand previously, and then we just work our way through the list. So, it's constant. So I like the hybridized version because you're constantly building relationships with people that might be interested in doing business. And then on the other hand, we're constantly looking for good deals. The quick question that came up was, what database do you use to do this? We use a CRM called Brivity, Brivity, that's proprietary, more so designed for realtors. But I would suggest if your database is a few hundred people pushing 1,000 and you're just kind of playing the joint venture game, Pipedrive, 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 and HubSpot, HubSpot, are the two best free CRMs for a fairly basic application. So that's what I would recommend. Okay. So to get back to it, there's absolutely smoker of a deal showed up, and we just kind of said, look, this is a great deal. I'm pretty sure we know enough people who are going to be interested in it. So let's just tie it up and then sit down for an afternoon and hit the phones. And that's exactly what we did.
100%. Yeah. And obviously, when you work a database, there's always those rules where you call 100 people, 10 people will answer, and you'll get one yes. So for us, obviously we're super busy in a realtor game. So we had to kind of set aside different times. So we were playing on Saturdays, playing on Sundays, trying to see if we can drum up the money to make this happen. So it was definitely about working that database and making sure that we got enough people in that sphere and in that cone to make something happen. And then from there, we grew that to essentially a webinar. And James and I made a quick Facebook Live video where we talked a little bit about the intricacies of putting that joint venture deal together. And we actually created a webinar because it was just a perfect opportunity to not have to replicate everything that we did. So we didn't have to host Saturday webinars for weeks and weeks because, the money that we were trying to raise wasn't a small amount of money. We're talking, we had a minimum investment of $100,000. And we had investors give us close to $500,000. So it just ranged on where our funds were coming from.
Yeah, and we did want to create some buzz around it, so we very intentionally hosted, and we had investors from like Vancouver, Victoria, Kamloops, Kelowna. I think somebody from Toronto tuned in. So, we had to respect our geographic boundaries, but we also wanted to create buzz. So I think we invited about 50 odd people to the webinar, had about 15 to 18 show up. And it's like, not all 15 to 18 people are going to be able to participate. So all of a sudden it created a bit of a buzz around the deal and, a scarcity mentality that pushed people into action. But I want to talk about what we did to create the pitch. because that's an often talked about, very rarely explored detail. And
Right.
so I would say the elements of our pitch, and Adrian, chime in. Adrian, chime in if you feel like I'm not elaborating enough. But the first thing we did was introduce ourselves. We want to establish that baseline of trust and credibility. So we introduced ourselves professionally, and similarly to the way that we are. Let's do the whole Penn and Teller thing where we're explaining the magic trick while we do it. I'm not talking about how great I am, and Adrian isn't talking about how great he is. We're pumping each other up, which gives way more credibility to that conversation. And so that's how we rolled that conversation out. I mean, I said everything I said about Adrian in this conversation, I said about him then, which is about how fantastic he is, and vice versa. So we broke down who we are, why we're great. We hyped each other up. And then we broke down how our partnership works so that people know what to expect. From there, this particular property had one of its main features was locationally driven, being in Bonnie Doon or Holyrood, close to the LRT. So we spent about 10 minutes talking about the location, the LRT, the Bonnie Doon redevelopment, the vision for the area. And that was a highly visual part of the presentation. There were almost no words. It was almost all pictures. And we just verbalized why that location was so good. Totally. The next thing we went into, jump in.
To jump back to and talking specifically about, obviously, like, geographical location is important, but we had a lot of people from the onset from Toronto, Kelowna, Vancouver. So they weren't Edmonton-based people, and a lot of these people hasn't even stepped foot in Edmonton as a city. So these people may have heard about Edmonton from one of the rain events, or from a Keyspire event, or from wherever, as being a good place to invest. So from the get-go, we had to start obviously introducing ourselves, but also talk a little bit about the city. And, as most people putting in money, our plan for this building was a 6-year hold. So 6 years is a really long time in some people's eyes to lock up that amount of money. In real estate, most people's rule is that 7 to 10 year timeline. So in our eyes, it wasn't too bad. But for a lot of those people who don't know the city, they needed to know what were the economic drivers of Edmonton? What are the economic drivers of this specific location? And so we, took it from a global perspective and then broke it down into that geographical location. So I just wanted to touch on that, James, just because I know that some people can get like micro detailed into it, and then people just get lost in the details versus just starting from that kind of global perspective.
Yeah, really good, really good way to describe. That's why we stayed very image based. So what we did is we like picture of Edmonton. Here's where it is in Edmonton. Boop, zoom in. Picture of the neighborhood. Here's where it is in the neighborhood. Boop. Here's the LRT map, and here's how close the walk is. Like, that was kind of the phased approach, using images to explain that. And then we said, and here's the future of the neighborhood: Bonnie Doon, Holyrood Gardens, LRT plan, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the points that we hit on.
Yeah.
From there we got into the numbers. And was it an off-market property? Yes, ma'am, it was. So, I mean, that's that. We were in the right place at the right time, and the opportunity came our way. But I mean, we were bold. We acted on it. I mean, it got socialized to us. It got socialized to a few other people. I don't think we were the only ones who had eyes on the deal, but we were the ones who jumped up to the plate, wrote the deposit check, and locked it up. Yeah.
Sorry, James. And to go back to definitely that point too, it's not like we were just throwing darts randomly. Like, we obviously wanted to tie it up and have that opportunity, but in order to have a successful joint venture and to create a good name, especially in the commercial game, in the commercial multifamily market, there are very few good commercial brokers. And so for us, understanding tying up this building might lose out on another opportunity for another commercial broker, say, who's brokering the deal. So for us, we wanted to have a high degree of confidence in order to actually get this deal done. So when we did lock this place up, James and I already talked about balancing and going through, our database. And I think Amy mentioned and Russell mentioned a couple good CRMs that they use to figure out where their joint ventures are. But for us, it was definitely important to be like, okay, here's our top 10 people who said, in passing that they would be interested in seeing an opportunity if we came across one. So when we jumped on that, we're hitting the phones obviously to make sure we're getting those top 10 people, and then opening up the sphere, because as you guys know, in a multifamily deal, conditions are anywhere between 30 and 60 days. So to lock up that amount of money can also take some time. So we want to make sure that we were balancing delicately, but also maintaining a good relationship with some of the other commercial people that we know in the business.
I'm going to riff off that. I mean, we knew that it wouldn't be good optics if we tied it up and didn't have the ability to close and just wasted time. So we walked into this thing with a very high degree of confidence that we would be able to raise the capital. And we knew that was leveraged on the strength of our connections, our database, and the strength of the deal. So, it had to be two pronged. Like, number one, a good deal attracts capital, yes. But number two, if we didn't know a dozen people who had a couple $100K kicking around, it would have been silly to tie it up and then start taking shots in the dark. Absolutely. Like Adrian said. So from that next step, we walked into the numbers. And this is where just the spreadsheets do the talking. Now, one of the ways that
Penn and Teller it, like James, this is James's strong suit. Like when I started with Mogul, we didn't even have a CRM. This guy created the most intense, crazy Excel spreadsheets that you could even imagine. And most of you have probably seen the Elite Property Analyzer to figure out what your cash flow is and figures out your mortgage and what your joint ventures would be paid. Like James created that from his just like crazy nerdness on Excel. And again, talking about the benefits of having different strengths on partners, it's something that I'm not great at, but James just absolutely kills it in that area. So when we got to that point in the conversation, James really took the lead on just walking through everybody in those through the numbers. And especially if you have people who are engineers or people who are professionals who deal with those sort of things, they can just take a look at your numbers and ask you very detailed questions very quickly. So you have to really understand what you're pitching and presenting so that you can have those answers for them so you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm going to throw an analogy out there. I feel like knowing your numbers is like having a black belt in a martial art. Like you have to be absolutely deadly at it, but the whole point of knowing it is so that you never have to use it. Mm-hmm. And so with your spreadsheet, like you need to know how every cell interacts with every other cell, specifically so that at any point, if anybody questions anything, with confidence. So I'm going to answer the question because this is exactly like how I roll it out when I do my presentation. Is you have to be ready for everything, but 19 out of 20 people don't like spreadsheets. They don't like numbers, and they just want to know how much money they're going to make. So I have this massive detailed spreadsheet that a chartered accountant could pick through and not find an error. And anybody can ask me any question about any number and how it fits. I know the answer. But when I actually do it in the presentation, I'm like, look, this is how much you put in. This is kind of how these expenses work. This is what this section means. Here's this, here's that, and here's the ROI. And these are the numbers that you want to work on. And if you want to stress test this spreadsheet, here are the 3 places that you stress test it. And I'll actually take those cells and like highlight some in yellow and blue so that it's color coded for what they mean. And then for the people that are super number oriented, if they start, if they want to get deep into it, we go deep. But the average person just wants to know that they can trust that you did it right. They don't actually want to go through the whole process through you. And then people who are numbers people, you can blow an entire joint venture presentation by spending 45 minutes on the numbers. So, you need, like, again, to go back to the martial arts analogy, you need to know your numbers down cold with the hopes that you never have to explain them in detail. But if it gets to that, you got to be able to. So we went over the numbers.
Yeah.
And
Amy had a good question there. She said, do you get into the hyper detailed specifics of it? And
never, unless I get pulled into it.
Yeah.
And even then, Even then, like I said, I highlight the cells that have manipulated variables so that they can start playing and stress testing on their own. I don't want to blow 10 minutes changing market appreciation from 2% to 4% to 5%. I don't want to spend 10 minutes. Do I then send the spreadsheets to partners? Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, like I'm comfortable enough with my ability to produce my spreadsheets so that I don't have this like proprietary ownership mentality over my masterpiece. Like it's a tool that I can use to help people want to partner with me, and it's a value add when I share it with them, and I want to teach them how to use it. So I'm like, okay, if you want to be more conservative, here's where you change the mortgage percentage. Here's where you play with the amortization. Here's where you can change the percentage ROI. Here's where you can change the rental projections. Here's where you can, like, I just let them know what all the levers are so that every person has a different perspective of where the market is going. I just show them how to move the levers in the spreadsheet so they can play around and stress test it on their own. And then I have a conversation with them about how to stress test it so they can paint their own worst case scenario. And usually what comes out of it is a number that they're still okay with in a worst case scenario. Again, I'm trying to blast through this because we're already going a little bit over time. But the next phase of the presentation was, we just put up one slide that said, how do I participate? So that was our big dramatic moment because like at that point, we would have done enough work in the presentation that people who are interested would want to know what to do next. So we went over the high level features of the joint venture. We talked about how it was 50-50, how much money we need, what the terms are, the duration, exit strategy, like just broad strokes. And then the final phase of the presentation was, if you want to reserve your spot in this joint venture, send us a 10K deposit. We'll send you a letter of intent. And sure enough, we had $60,000 sitting in our bank account by the end of the day of people that gave us deposits. So it went really, really well. The takeaway there is like, before you start putting offers on properties, if you have a joint venture partner that's super serious, if you're doing like kind of the partner first approach, let them show you they're serious by putting 5K either in your bank account or at least in trust to get it going. So, I wasn't sure how this conversation was going to roll out, but I mean, the pitch is such an important part of it. And I really get into the pitch. So, Adrian, where do you want to steer this next? Let's try to do maybe 5 to 8 more minutes of chat about this deal. And guys, know that we are going fast on purpose because we're being respectful of time. And it took us months and months and months of dedicated work to do this deal. We're trying to boil it down into a 25-minute chat. How do we decide on our deposit? 10K seemed like a nice round number, and we were trying to raise $100,000 chunks, and it was 10,000 of it. So 10, 10,000, 100,000. It all just kind of fit together nicely in terms of it all seeming like it was a nice round number for good optics.
One of the questions that I think came up twice was, do your joint venture partners on a commercial deal have to be guarantors?
100%.
So the question is yes. There's no way around it. There's nothing that you can do. Even if you put it in a corporation, even if you structure it all these crazy different ways, the way that the lenders and the underwriters go through the process is super thorough. So if you have a corporation, you're trying to hide behind it and not have a guarantor, they're going to break down that corporation, find out who the owners are, and every single person needs to do a personal net worth statement and sign as a guarantor.
Yeah, there's no way around it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Corey, that's a great question, but we'll answer it more towards that actually be, that's a great question for Russell. So save that for Russell because that's a good Russell question. That's a great Russell question. Let's keep talking about this deal, Adrian. So we've got our letters of intent. The next step is like, let's get into the unanimous shareholders agreement. So if you want to get one drafted from scratch, RMLO will charge you $7,500 to $10,000. I already had a template for my previous 13 deals, so we just polished it up for this deal and sent it out. And then we had a second meeting where we brought the partners together to review the unanimous shareholders agreement. Everybody's lawyer had a couple of tweaks and edits. We incorporated all of them, and then we were ready for sign off.
And I think that's a good point too, is we didn't just send it to them and say, hey, take a look, review this, and then send it back to me, because there are so many legalese terms that can be pretty scary for a joint venture partner. And especially talking on the commercial side, being guarantors, is breaking it down into like plain English terms is super helpful. So we were super specific, and we were just hyper analyzing, going through everything and just breaking it down into plain English so everybody understood what these items were talking about, so that when they sent it off, they knew what they were sending to the lawyers and that they could answer some of those questions. And if things became a little bit sticking, we talked about it, and we, if we agreed with it, we would work with it. If not, we said, this is why it's in this point, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that a lot of people get stuck up in the unanimous shareholders agreements or the joint venture agreements, and just being able to break through it and get to simple English terms helps people understand. And then there's no, confusion if things ever, go haywire.
Yeah, and I'd say, from a money partner perspective, what most people want to know is like the general details and the broad strokes. And then when you hand off those numbers, when they hand off those numbers to their accountant and they hand off the legal paperwork to their lawyer, they just want what comes back to corroborate what the broad strokes that you described are, right, for the most part. So like, okay, here's what's going on in the spreadsheet. You'll notice this. Their accountant's going to analyze it and then come back and be like, well, this is what I observed. And they're going to say, oh, that's about what James and Adrian said. You go through the whole legal agreement with them in broad strokes, and they come back and say, okay, this is what this agreement says and means. They're like, okay, yeah, in broad strokes, that's what I understood it to be as well. You want that to all be in alignment, which is why, to go back to the black belt analogy or whatever, you need to know your stuff inside and out, so that when you distill it down to its broad strokes, that's going to be in alignment with what their trusted advisor, their lawyer, and their accountant say.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just everybody being on the same team and just coming to a general understanding, because we've been super blessed that we had other lawyers look at these unanimous shareholders agreements. And like James said, he used these for his past 13 deals. So when we go through every single document by lawyer, things get changed. The document is a better document at the end of the day.
It's been polished 13 times through 13 different iterations by 13 groups of lawyers. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. So, I mean, don't be worried about giving the joint venture agreement to your partner's lawyer. Look at it as an opportunity to get free legal advice to make your agreement better for next time.
Totally.
So, Adrian, let's start wrapping it up. What do you want to end on? What are some key details about this deal that we want to wrap it up with?
Well, key details for like this specific property. We focus on a couple of things: timeline, how much money in, and what is our potential exit strategies based on, what the plan for the building is. So, in this specific situation, what we actually did was we assumed a mortgage. And so I talked about the 6-year timeline. And basically the reason for that was we were assuming a super low interest rate for about a year and a half. And then we were going to re-sign another 5-year renewal. And at that 6-year timeline, we had options. And so the reason I bring that up is really figuring out exactly, what is the game plan for this deal, and is it going to cater to the joint venture partners that you're bringing to the table? Find out exactly what they want. And, we go back to the conversation with Brent and Wendy, and I think I saw a comment come up about splitting cash flow and all those sort of things. You need to be aligned with your partnership on what the plan is. So, for example, with Brent and Wendy and with Matt and myself, we didn't need to take cash flow every month. So for our plan, and I think Brent said, I haven't made a nickel yet. Well, it's true. All that money we're doing is we're putting it back into the houses. We're putting it back into our reserve funds so we can build that up. And when we want to sell and we can exit, then we all take our large profit checks that we made and that we sacrificed for. Same thing with this joint venture with James and with the group, was just being able to figure out what everybody wanted and structure it in a way that made sense so that we catered to what people wanted. So that was, for me, it's probably the biggest thing. And I think it definitely attracted to the right joint venture partners. James.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it was fun to put the deals together, and guys, just in the interest of making as much time for Russell as possible, I'm just going to hard stop it. But know that Adrian and I love this stuff. Like, we super, super into it. And if you have a genuine interest in doing a deeper dive into the mechanics of doing a deal where it's multiple partners and you have to do a corporate structure, just shout us out. The people are now going to ask for contact. So I'm setting sales right away here, guys. So shiver me timbers. Reach out to Adrian and take him out for a coffee, and he'll be more than happy to talk to you about it. So, Adrian, thank you so much for doing this deal with me. Thanks for thanks for being such a kick-ass partner, and stoked to take this thing over the next 5 years and just watch that value grow as the LRT and Bonnie Doon gets up and running. So